Hello and welcome to the next webinar in our how-to series brought to you by Strengthening the Heartland. I am Amber Letcher, one of the co-founders of this group, and we're really excited to see all of you here today to talk about another really important topic. So before I introduce our speaker for the day, just a couple house cleaning items for us. If you would like to follow along with the presentation, there are two handouts linked in your handout panel. And you are also welcome to ask questions at any point during the presentation. You can type those into the questions part of your panel. You can type them in at any time. We usually wait until the end to answer them and go through them, but you're more than welcome to type at any time. And then the last thing that you will see is a link to a survey. If you can take a couple minutes to fill that out at the end of the webinar, we really appreciate it. It just gives us a sense of who's with us today, and there's also a spot for you to tell us what topics you want to hear next. So that's really helpful in our planning. It only takes a couple of minutes. It's super short, so we really appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to turn it on to the reason you are here today, to hear from our speaker, Monica Rivera. Welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I will be your tour guide for the day. And I'm super grateful for the opportunity to be here with you. I wish we were in one big giant room together so that I could be interacting one-on-one, but we're going to do our best with this. I have some frameworks for the session to get us started, a little bit to know about how this is going to work. First of all, I'm coming to you from the occupied homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and people, also known as Colorado. I think it's really important to start sessions with a simple but meaningful land acknowledgement, and there's a link right there on the slide. If you're not sure whose land you're on, you can go to whose.land and figure that out and offer your own gratitudes. A general content warning. Obviously, when we're talking about issues of consent, we're going to be talking about sexual violence, sexuality. I do try to make this topic as light and approachable as possible. But there will be no depictions of violence, no videos. I don't use any case studies or examples of specific violence. Like has already been mentioned by Amber, you can participate by dumping questions in the chat. She has full permission to interrupt me at any point, and hopefully we'll be able to get to as many of your questions as possible. It's important to know that we need to hold context. Context is what I often say, because what I'm going to share with you today is my own professional and personal experience, but that's also through the lens of my identities, the context of my family, my community. And so whatever we talk about today, it's important that you put it in your own context of your identities, your communities, your professional experience and expectations, some of the spoken and unspoken expectations of those things. And so I'm going to keep it as broad as possible, knowing that that you're going to need to sort of apply it as needed. Language. I'm going to be using the term survivor and victim interchangeably, and I would invite you to do that as well in your own areas of influence. Some people prefer the term victim, other people prefer the term survivor. I identify as a survivor, and so unless someone self-identifies in a particular way, it's important to use those terms interchangeably. And I'm also going to be using the pronoun they when talking about victims and also talking about people who cause harm. We know that not all people who cause harm are men. We know that not all people who are harmed are women, and so it's important that we try to mix that up so that we are honoring the fact that people of any gender can perpetrate and people of any gender can experience victimization. And then again, kind of like I said, I'm going to be talking about youth in general. And so whether you're here because you have small humans in your own personal life, or you're in the education field or the medical field, or I know that on the registrations, it seemed like people were coming from a lot of really different professional contexts, that the concepts that we're going to be talking about are really applicable broadly. The other thing to know is that we're going to be, when you think about the iceberg of interpersonal violence or sexual violence prevention, education, conversations about consent, oftentimes we enter in at the policy level. So these are things like, Title IX, internal sexual misconduct policies that might exist at a university, things like VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, policies around mandatory reporting, the process of getting an order of protection. So it's, oftentimes policies are shaped by really small groups of people, often attorneys, with a very specific scope. And so those are important conversations to have, I think, particularly when you're at an institution. We have to know what those are. We have to know the law. But really, that should be the floor. Like the threshold for a sexual misconduct policy should really be the lowest level of how we understand. And really what I want us to be doing today is to expanding our minds to be thinking more about culture, a paradigm shift. So for example, we may have a school system may have a policy that says a coach cannot be in a locker room with youth athletes one-on-one. That's an important policy to have. And we can't stop there. We can't say just because we have that policy, then we don't need to also examine what is the culture that that coach is creating? How is that coach interrupting or not interrupting problematic conversations or comments that are being made amongst players, et cetera. So just remembering that we're going to spend most of our time in the cultural realm. And that does sometimes, I would say, even the cultural realm might even butt up a bit against our policies, but those are still really important conversations to be having. I'm going to kind of fly through this because you hopefully know this. You signed up for it. These are the objectives. Basically, we're going to be talking about the concepts of body sovereignty as it relates to children, understanding the role of human services professional and in particular in a child's development of body sovereignty, how to understand the importance of body sovereignty as one component of trauma-informed care, particularly for families who are impacted by interpersonal violence. I think one of the other challenges when we only have conversations in the policy realm is a lot of times those policies are designed to prevent future instances of violence. Super important. And we all interface with survivors, childhood sexual abuse survivors every day who we will never really have any say in their case. They're not going to go to the criminal legal system. What happened to them maybe happened years ago. So if I still have a course where there's an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse in my class, the cultural pieces are really the places where I have an influence on being able to retain them, helping them, navigate the course material. And then how to develop practical applications for body sovereignty in professional contexts. So a lot of this work for me started with a very simple question. I've been teaching courses on interpersonal violence for over 15 years, and I always ask my students, how much of your body do you own? And it sometimes seems like a really obvious question, like nobody tells me what to do with my body. But in reality, when we explore that a little bit more, we learn a few things. So I give students this activity. I say that I want you to spend 24 hours giving and receiving explicit verbal consent. Meaning before you touch anyone, before you hug anyone, you ask them first, can I have a hug? And before, if someone comes up to you, arms outstretched, waiting to hug you, that you pause them and say, hold on a minute, can you please ask me for consent? So I ask them to do that and then to come report back. And what they report back really tends to fall into 3 different categories. So the first one has a lot to do with identity. I hear a lot from my female students, I get touched all day long. Sometimes this activity is actually kind of triggering for them because they didn't realize how much physical touch they kind of block out. They don't even pay attention to when they're in a restaurant or a bar and someone places their hand on the back of their lower back to move behind them. They kind of don't even notice. But all of a sudden, this activity helps them realize that they're touched all day long by friends, partners, bosses, teachers, strangers on the bus. I hear from male students that, oh my God, I touch people all day long. I didn't even realize that I was just sort of out there hugging and putting my arm around people. An interesting gender dynamic, though, is that they do notice that they most often touch their female friends and their female coworkers. And again, this is not in a predatory sort of way. It really is just a cultural like, hey, how's it going? And that they're more likely to do that with women. When they do engage in physical contact with their male friends, it's usually more kind of playfully combative, punching on the arm, that kind of thing. So there is a difference in how touch is used culturally. The next piece is that, or the next pattern is the reactions. So I hear a lot from women that the experience of doing 24 hours of consent was really uncomfortable. They said, I felt really guilty asking for people to ask me first. I didn't want to seem rude. I hear from all students, there's no way I could ever not hug and then insert a certain person. I hear more from women than men that there's no way they could not hug their boss. Their boss comes in, wants to hug them. There's no way they feel like they couldn't do that. I hear also, so with the activity, I give students 2 excuses and I ask them to kind of switch them up. So I say, for some people, tell them, I'm in this ridiculous class and I have to do this activity. So will you ask me for consent first? And then I say, but other people really own it. Like, say, I've been thinking a lot about consent lately and it's really important to me. And so would you mind asking me first? And what I hear from students is that they often feel way more comfortable blaming the class. Even if they're kind of in line, if they're like, I actually kind of like this consent thing, they still feel like they'd rather blame it on the class. And across the board from all students, I hear that the people who are closest to me got the most defensive, particularly when I really owned it. So it's our best friends and our siblings who say, well, gosh, what's your problem? Or, you're my best friend. I shouldn't even have to ask. Like, why are you being so weird? And so again, those tend to fall in gendered lines. Then the last piece that I learned is that students really don't have a very strong working understanding of what consent even is, or what sexual assault is. And so while I said we're going to be talking about sort of a little bit about policy, a little bit about definitions, but really wanting to expand that to be more about cultural, it is important that we first start with the definitions. So sexual assault is any unwanted sexual act where the person performing the act has not obtained consent from the other person. And consent, there are legal definitions to consent. Now, obviously, each state might have different nuances of how they define sexual assault. So I'm not saying this is the state or federal definition. I'm saying this is kind of the general working definition of sexual assault for content experts in this field. And the legal elements of consent are cooperation in act and attitude. Someone has to be saying yes and doing yes. Their body has to be indicating that they're wanting what's happening. Exercise of free will, you can't pressure someone or coerce someone into doing something. And then knowledge of what's happening. So someone has to know that what's happening to their body. So this is where intoxicants come into play. So most of the students that I work with do not have an understanding of this. And what's interesting though is that in reality, we have a pretty robust culture of consent about physical objects. So, I would never just reach over the table and drink out of someone's water bottle without asking, can I have a drink of water? I would say, hey, can I borrow a sweatshirt? I wouldn't just go rummaging through someone's drawers. We say, is this seat taken? Can I borrow this pencil? I would never just use someone's toothbrush at their house when I had dinner at their house, right? If I needed to borrow your car and I said, can I take your car to Target? It's safe to say that you mean Target in our town, not Target 1,600 miles away. So just because you consent to one thing doesn't mean I have free reign to do whatever I want with your car. So we have actually a pretty complex way of communicating when asking for consent for physical objects. We just have a harder time translating that to other people's physical bodies, to understanding that I don't actually have a right to my son's body. If I want a hug and he doesn't want to give me a hug, I don't have a right to that. And so what I want us to do is, the reason why I'm kind of starting with this sort of foundation is it'd be easy for me to roll in here and do, here are the 10 things that you can say that are trauma informed and support consent culture. But if you engage in those conversations with kids without first having a solid understanding of the myths and the facts and the basic notions of what is and is not sexual assault, what is the culture of consent, it's going to be easier to operate from myths or from misconceptions. So that's part of what the foundation that I'm laying right now. I ask students 2 other questions too often. I'll ask them, if you had 24 hours that you could do whatever you wanted and you wouldn't have to worry about your body being hurt at all, no physical harm, what types of things would you do? Again, we see gender differences. So our cisgender men say things like, oh, I would jump out of an airplane without a parachute. I'd go rock climbing without a rope. I would take my mountain bike down the steepest, clearly I'm not a mountain biker, but they talk about doing like really rugged, really risky outdoor activities. For our women and trans folks, they say things like, oh, I would sleep with my windows open at night, or I go running early in the morning or after the sun has set, or I would go camping all by myself for the weekend. So the answers to these questions really are indicating that gender is at least a small part of the picture when we talk about body sovereignty. Who feels like they have the right and the safety to do with their body what they want to do? Now, I don't say that to shame or blame cisgender men, not at all, but rather like it's sort of silly if we're talking about, how to talk to youth about consent and we're not infusing gender a little bit into the conversation, because it is a deeply gendered phenomenon. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then I also ask students, what do you do every day to prevent yourself from being sexually assaulted? Meaning the minute you wake up in the morning, you start thinking, I have to make sure I do this, and then I have to make sure I do this, so that I am not sexually assaulted today. I ask the cis men in my class first, and it's usually crickets. I don't get a lot of answers. And then I ask the women and trans folks, and they just, come at me with lots of answers. Things like, I make sure I have my phone on me 24 hours a day. Every minute of my day, someone knows where I am and where I'm expected to be and when I'm expected to be home. I don't walk late at night in dark places. I check the backseat of my car before I drive. I carry my keys between my fingers. I mean, it's like they just list all of these things. And so again, we see gender dynamics in terms of who is shifting their behavior in order to accommodate the fact that violence happens. Now, all the things that I just listed that we hear from women and trans folks are what we consider risk reduction strategies. I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things. I do those things. They really are the things that help reduce our risk of being harmed, but they're not actually prevention. The only person responsible for preventing violence is the person who's going to choose to commit it. I use an example of driving in a car. So I can make sure I always drive with my hands at 10 and 2, and I don't text while I drive, I don't eat while I drive, I have a seatbelt on, I have a car with airbags to reduce my risk of being harmed. But I can't prevent someone from T-boning me in an intersection. I'll probably be harmed, right? So this is important with sexual violence, and I'm going to use another social issue to illustrate kind of how backwards we've been. So when you think about the issue of drinking and driving, we have had since the 80s primary prevention. So messages directed at potential drunk drivers: don't drink and drive. We've had messages at bystanders, right? So friends don't let friends drive drunk. We've talked about key collection programs and having a designated driver. We really have not had a risk reduction where we're talking to potential victims of drunk driving, where we say like, do not leave your house after 10 o'clock because there's drunk drivers on the street. So just like, make sure you stay home. We don't really do that. But in reality, with sexual violence, we have lived almost exclusively in that bottom category for decades. We are talking to potential victims about things that they can do to reduce their risk of being harmed. A little bit of bystander intervention has happened kind of in the 90s and the early 2000s. But much newer is this concept that we need to be talking to people about how to not commit assault. Now, often what happens is our minds immediately go to sort of serial perpetrators, and that's not actually who I'm talking about. The vast majority of the survivors that I've worked with over the 20 years that I've been in this field really have not, very, very few have been harmed by strangers in the bushes or, sort of the Lifetime movie scenario, if you will. Most of the people that I have worked with have been harmed by friends, partners, coaches, mentors, teachers, the people who, they feel closest to. And so that's all of us. And I think that there's a lot of ways that we unintentionally undermine consent that actually gets in the way of prevention and may actually be ways that we're causing harm without knowing. Some quick national statistics. We know 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men, and 1 in 2 trans, gender nonconforming, non-binary folks will experience violence. 75 to 80% of the time, they're harmed by someone they know. On a college campus, that usually jumps to 95 to 98%. So the vast majority of students are harmed by people that they know: faculty members, TAs, mentors, peers. And 98% of perpetrators identify as male, and that's regardless of the gender of the victim. So even when, you know, people will sometimes say, well, hold on a minute, like men get raped too. And it's like, absolutely. And most of the time they're raped by other men. And again, we don't say that to shame or blame men, but rather that it would be somewhat irresponsible for us to engage in a conversation about how do we prevent sexual violence without holding the fact that it's a deeply gendered phenomenon, that the folks who are causing harm are overwhelmingly coming from one gender identity. And so there might be something cultural about the ways that we are raising those folks. So like I said, I've been working with college students for a long time. This is the picture on the left is a photograph of me and some of my students doing prevention education on a college campus. And then in 2011, I had the opportunity to become a parent of a small human. So that's a picture of me and my son. His name's Mateo. We borrowed Santa's chair because I think it's creepy to sit on a strange man's lap. And so, you know, I kind of had this like cultural clash because I was working with college students talking about consent. And then I was raising this kid and reading books like Sam I Am, which is like 98 pages long. It's like the longest kid's book. And it is page after page of this character saying, no, I don't want green eggs and ham. And the other little character is constantly saying, come on, what if you do it this way? What if I do it this way? So my brain kind of broke for a minute because I'm like, wow, what messages am I giving my kiddo here at such a young age that really undermines all the stuff that I'm trying to help college students show up as grown adults without a working understanding. So that really led me to developing a number of tips on how to talk to kids about consent, how to infuse body sovereignty into our relationships with kids. I think the list is now at like 59. I'm not going to do all those today. Don't worry, we're just going to go through 10. But know that if this is a topic that's interesting to you, there's more to explore. So the first one I'm going to start with is avoid the talk. And what we mean by that is, you know, a lot of times I'll hear from parents like, oh, I don't know how to talk to my kids about sex. So we automatically assume that when we're going to talk about consent, it's when we're time to have the birds and the bees talk or the sex education talk. But I want us to really think about like, how old were you when someone sat you down and said, okay, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about what it means to be kind or what it means to share. We don't really approach other cultural expectations that way, where we like are nervous about it. We wait till our kids can understand it. Even with like math, you think about math. We don't wait until our kids are 18 and have the developmental ability to learn and understand all levels of math to start teaching math. We start teaching age appropriate, small little nuggets of math starting before preschool. And then the more they grow, the more information they get. And I think that one of the mistakes that we make with consent culture is that we wait too long because we think we only have to wait till they're ready to talk about sex. I think rather than having the talk, we need to be having hundreds of talks. We need to be infusing the topic of consent and body sovereignty into everyday moments, and using the word consent beyond the context of sex. And so similar to how you would teach kindness or sharing, I learned that from watching other people. I learned that from really small micro corrections that I heard from people, whether they were peers or parents or mentors who said, oh, that wasn't very kind, or it's important to share, that we need to be doing that with a concept of consent. Number 2 is your body, your choice. We say this one a lot in our house. There's pros and cons to that. You still, up until I have a TED talk, and in it, I think my kiddo was much younger, and he was saying, I don't want to go to school today, my body, my choice. And he is now 11 and still uses that on us. It doesn't work. But yeah, your body, your choice is a tenet of our household. So this means when safe and possible, allowing kids to make small decisions that impact their bodies without compromising their safety. This was a really important value for me going into parenting, and it was easier for me to kind of wax poetic about, oh yeah, your body, your choice, when I had a small infant and a baby. But then the first time I had a toddler who could talk and express that he didn't want to go to the dentist, he didn't want to get vaccines, all of a sudden I really had to face, wait, what does this mean in practicality? So our kids know that it's your body, your choice within the context of safety. So you have to go to the dentist. If you have a cavity, you're going to have to get it filled. But we do try to put some element of choice in there. So who do you want to go with you to the dentist? Which do you want to bring a lovey or a stuffed animal? So they understand that it's part of our job as parents to make sure that they're safe and healthy. And so when I'm talking about this, I really am talking more about like if your kid wants to wear a costume to Target, who cares? Like just let them do it. It's about letting them have some agency and say over what happens to their body. It's also about not undermining their authority over the sensations in their body. So we don't say things like "you're not hungry" or you don't really have a headache or that didn't hurt. We let them name what's happening for their body. And there's times when my kid has just eaten and then had a snack, and I know they have enough food in their belly. I don't say, "You're not hungry." I say, "Well, I know that you had enough food for your belly, so maybe you're in the mood to eat something. Right now, we're not going to eat something." So there's ways to still be the parent or be the authority to have structure without undermining what they are telling you about their bodies. This is really important as in terms of sexual abuse prevention too, because particularly younger kids, and by younger kids, I'm meaning like 5th grade and under, if they're experiencing sexual abuse, it's sometimes their body will, even if they don't cognitively have a emotional understanding that what's happening to them is wrong, because the person who's doing it is someone they care about. Sometimes, they say the body keeps the score. So you may have like upset stomachs or headaches or difficulty sleeping. And so there's going to be physical and physiological impact from trauma, even if you haven't yet connected it to that trauma. And so if we're constantly saying, "Oh, you don't have a belly ache," you say that every day and you're fine the next day, we might be missing a warning sign that something's happening to our kiddos. In a professional context, I think offering choice as often as possible. So whether you're a teacher, whether you're a doctor, thinking about how kids can have some say in what happens to their bodies. When there is no choice, taking the time to explain that. So, not just saying, "Get in the car, we got to go," or in a professional context saying, if there's a lockdown drill, not just saying you don't get to, everyone has to do it, but actually explaining why what they're being asked to do with their body is important. Allowing kids to be the expert on their bodily sensations. I think this is huge, particularly for like middle school educators. So sometimes, I'll hear teachers say, "Well, my kids in my classroom, they abuse the bathroom passes. They ask to go to the bathroom or they ask to go to the nurse just so they can get out of an assignment." And I don't discredit that. I grew up in New Jersey public schools. I know all the ways to get out of class. That is super valid. And there are still going to be kids in that class who have actual bathroom needs, who might have started their period for the first time, and that's the 5th time they've asked for a bathroom pass, but they actually need it now. So I would really encourage figuring out other ways to manage behavior issues, but for things where a kid can advocate for needing either the bathroom or needing to go to the nurse, that we don't police that, because it is one of the few ways within a classroom context that they can advocate. More your body, your choice. So kids should not be forced to give physical affection to anyone, not even parents. We can't guilt or shame them. This is hard for me when I say, "Oh, I had a bad day, can I have a hug?" And they're like, "Nah." Or I hear now cringe, that I don't say, "But I just said I had a bad day." Or like, "When you're sad, I hug you." So that's like guilt. It's laying, again, this cultural foundation that makes someone think, when I care about somebody and they have a physical need, it's my job to fulfill that need. Now, as grown adults in relationships, it's not always that clear of a connection, but there are roots there. We hear from people in abusive relationships that, "God, I didn't even know," not even abusive. I would say I work with college students, again, mostly women, who say, "I actually didn't know I could say no to sex when I've been dating someone for a year. I just thought that's part of a relationship." And part of that, again, the fertile soil where those types of beliefs are rooted, is this idea that it is your job to use physical affection to make other people feel better. I also have an unpopular opinion. I hear a lot from people like, well, in my family context, sometimes it's about religious expectations or cultural expectations, racial or ethnic expectations. You know, there's no way that I could tell grandma that she needs to ask for a hug. It's just not going to happen. I believe that that is true. I believe that those cultural expectations exist. And we can't live in a world where kids will be able to advocate for themselves in relationships and live in a world where the adults in our families have free reign to those kids' bodies without the kids having the cultural ability to say no. You can't have both of those, right? And so if you have a family dynamic where it is like, I could not imagine my kid being able to avoid giving certain family members a hug, it might be a little bit of a flag that you also have a family cultural context where adults know they have access to kids and kids do not necessarily feel empowered to speak up about that. It's not comfortable to talk about, but it is we have to choose which, whose priorities are we going to center? The priorities of the cultural needs of our adults or the kids in those situations. Celebrate and affirm boundaries whenever you see kids or hear kids setting boundaries, whether it's with friends or siblings, saying like, hey, nice job. I heard you set a boundary with that toy. Good job. Like, so really paying attention to that and affirming it. And then offering students choices before touching. You can also model this with colleagues. So if you, doing this intentionally, let's say, again, I work in a public school, and let's say I have a colleague who I know did something really great. I might say, nice job. Would you like a high five or a hug? Now, notice the framing. I didn't say, can I have a hug? If you think about someone, let's say in a position of power, a boss saying, can I have a hug? Can you do this for me? It's much harder to say no than if someone says, would you like a hug? You're able to say no. And so especially when we're talking about kids, as adults, we have a power dynamic with kids, no matter who the child is. And so framing it as, would you like a high five? Would you like a hug? And then modeling that with the other adults so kids in your life can see that. Number 3 is body literacy. So teaching about nonverbal cues in real life, books, etc. So, paying attention to, if I see my son playing with a friend, I might say, oh, look, hold on, pay attention to his face. It doesn't look like he's enjoying that. When reading a book, a storybook with younger kids, you can say, pay attention to this character. Does she look happy here or no? Or look at his face. Do you think he looks happy or no? This is really important because, most of the college students I work with will say, obviously someone who's kicking and screaming is a clear no. What gets missed though is that things like, I'm not sure, maybe we should wait, let's slow down, and then silence are all no. Those all mean no legally. I've watched a shift even within the criminal legal system during the time of my career. Early on in my career, when I would accompany survivors to the police department, I would hear police officers asking, at what point did you say no? And the longer in my career, I started to see that shift. I heard police officers asking survivors, at what point did you say yes? At any point? And then asking perpetrators or people who have caused harm, where did you get a clear yes? At what point did this person say yes? It's a subtle shift, but it's, I think, an important one. So making sure that we're paying attention to nonverbal cues. Using age-appropriate, anatomically correct, gender-expansive terms. And so what I'm meaning by this is that, an elbow is an elbow, a penis is a penis, trying really hard to not use play names for particularly private parts. Kids can pick up on the fact that all of a sudden you're not using, like, you don't say like your hoo-hoo for an elbow, like that, it would be silly. They would be like, what? It's an elbow. But for private parts, oftentimes we don't use the anatomically correct terms. And this is really important. It is a deterrent. So we do know from research with childhood sexual abuse perpetrators that when they have a kid, they encounter a child that seems to have a large vocabulary and understanding of their body, a level of comfort advocating for themselves, that it's a deterrent. And then also, should something happen with a kid, they already have the language to very specifically explain what's happening to their body, what the sensation is, and they're not nervous to talk about a penis. I say gender expansive terms because if you're going to be teaching kids anatomically correct body parts, it's a great opportunity to disentangle gender from that. So saying people with a penis, people with a vagina, we say, you know, most people with a penis identify as male. So just helping also create some of that inclusivity for our intersex, trans, non-binary folks. Avoid and interrupt the shaming of bodies or bodily functions. So in our house, it's really hard, but we try really hard to not, like, if one kid uses the bathroom and it stinks and the other one's like, ugh, that smells nasty, we say, we don't shame. Poop is normal. It's supposed to smell. And so we try to interrupt any sort of shaming, or sometimes it's, you know, kids like to talk about farts and that's funny, but really when we're talking about what's happening, if someone gets a bloody nose, we interrupt. If someone's like, ooh, gross, we talk about periods. Our sons know what a tampon is. They know that, you know, the uterus, people who have a uterus, the lining sheds and the tampon absorbs the blood. Like, we use these words almost as though they're in the medical profession. And it's really, really important because if kids are going to need to be able to talk about consent, talk about the ways that maybe they have had boundaries crossed, they need to do that. Narrating nonverbal cues. This is a little bit about teaching nonverbal cues, but this one's actually narrating them. So look at that person's face in the moment. It doesn't look like they want that. This is also really important. One of my kiddos is on the autism spectrum, and so he has a harder time knowing, like, social cues. And so we've been working really hard about to like help him identify what body language means. When someone does this or someone seems to back up, that's them saying they need more space. Honor no and make it fun. This is number 4. So we listen and stop when kids express no or stop or, you know, enough. We avoid making it punitive. So if it's a game of tag or a game of tickle and, you know, a kiddo says, no, no, stop, we don't say, well, you know, you should have said stop, right? Or you shouldn't have said you wanted to play, or God, I was only playing, stop being so sensitive. So we let kids know that stop is just as important part of the game as go. And we try to create really fun ways to do start stop. If you think about the concept of tag and how critical home base was, sometimes you just needed that home base where you were safe and no one could tag you. That is sort of the concept with tickle games or chase games. Avoid using guilt, kind of self-explanatory in that one. And then celebrate and notice when you see kids in their interactions with other kids saying no. So I heard Remy say no 3 times, and she shouldn't have to say no more than once. So overhearing and narrating out loud when you're seeing boundary violations. Now, sometimes what I'll hear is people at the playground say things like, you know, you need to be nice, or no one's going to want to play with you if you're not nice. Well, that's important. And as it relates to talking to youth about consent, you have to name specific behaviors. So your brother has asked you to stop putting your stuffed animal on his head. Please stop putting your stuffed animal on his head. So naming specific behaviors is important. Number 5 is don't raise kids, raise adults. So I want you to think about, in what context have you heard the phrase boys will be boys? Most of the time when I've ever heard this in a kind of cultural context, it's when we see boys or men acting in ways that are kind of disruptive. It's not necessarily bad, it could be playful, but loud, rowdy, you know, maybe breaking things, wrestling, punching. And so we sort of categorize that as expected of kids. And we see, this was a photograph taken at one of the stores of t-shirts for little kids, and the color is ones that were designed for boys say lock up your daughters, and then the pink one says does this diaper make my butt look big? So again, they're silly. I'm not trying to say like, oh, the people who made these should be arrested. I'm not trying to say that, but they're little, really subtle ways that we lay, again, that foundation, where this idea of lock up your daughters, this idea that, you know, we can't expect more of boys. When we say boys will be boys, it means that we're not really interrupting the behavior. I was on a playground and a little boy knocked over a little girl's sandcastle, and it wasn't my son who did it, but I was helping sort of scoop up the sand, and the mom of the little girl said, you know, oh, it's okay, boys will be boys. And in that instant, it really undermines the expectations we have for boys. And the reality, like I've said already, is that boys become men, and 98% of perpetrators identify as male, regardless of the gender of the victim. So I'm raising 2 sons, and it's important to me that when I see them interacting with peers or each other in a way that that same behavior, if someone tells you, stop touching me 3 times, if you're an 18-year-old on a college campus, it's now getting into that sexual violence misconduct policy. That's the floor, right? So I have to intervene and say, hold on a minute, time out. Someone shouldn't have to say more than once that they don't want something. So we really have to dig in on this with boys. With our girls and non-binary kiddos, I think it's more about affirming boundaries. When you think about the adults that I've already referenced who feel guilty for asking for what they need or setting boundaries, so pay attention to feelings of guilt or shame. If a kiddo says, you know, I don't want to play with that person, they make me uncomfortable, but I feel bad, I don't want them to think I'm mean, it's okay to affirm that you get to choose who you want to hang out with. Be nice gets translated for girls and non-binary folks as I feel guilty. It ends up turning into guilt. Pay attention to gender dynamics with pretend play. So there are gender differences between when we're an adult playing with a little kid. We know, this is from sociological studies, that you're more likely to say, I'm gonna get you, for a little girl, and we're more likely to say, no, don't get me, for little boys. Again, not every time across the board, but there are patterns. So there are gender dynamics in pretend play. Another tip is to conduct environmental audits. So whether you're a teacher or an educator or even in your own home, to sort of pause for a minute and walk into a room as though you're a researcher or as though you're, you know, a creature from another planet, and look at the things on the walls, look at the books on the bookshelf, and really look for gendered messages. Look for things that you might not even realize are sending gendered expectations that again lay that foundation. Number 6 is don't agonize, sloganize. So when you think about your own upbringing as a kiddo, and whether you were raised by parents or grandparents, or, you know, I think about mentors or coaches who are involved in your life, if I was to ask you what directives or mottos or values did you hear almost every day? You know, things like, you know, we don't leave family behind, or I'm spacing on any of them. I'm wondering if people would be down to dump some in the chat. It might be kind of fun to read some of them, but the things not related to consent, that's not the question I'm asking. I'm asking just general kind of values. What did you hear from your parents or from the adults in your life? So dump those in the chat and then we'll revisit them in a minute. So similarly, pick a slogan related to body sovereignty though, and use it often. So in our house, when the kids leave every day, even my 11-year-old, we say gentle hands and kind words. Gentle hands and kind words. They will hear that in their heads. We also tend to say gentle with bodies, or I'll say remember, bodies are fragile. So rather than saying, you know, don't hit your brother on the arm, I might say, please be gentle with bodies. So it's taking the concept of body sovereignty, how careful we need to be with each other's bodies, and putting it into a slogan that they'll hear over and over and over. In a classroom, you could say, oh, hold on, we hug before, we ask before hugging in our classroom. So it's not, you know, Mateo, get off of, you know, Kevin. We say, we ask before hugging in this classroom. So sloganizing it. In a professional application, pay attention to what you say frequently. If you're a teacher, whether that's K through 12 or in college, you definitely have catchphrases that you use all the time. Ask your students if you're not sure. And is it projecting what you want it to project? And have you very clearly, whether it's in a syllabus or whether it's in your opening statements during when a course starts, have you set expectations about behavior, about consent in the classroom, about interrupting problematic comments? Number 7 is teach self-advocacy and bystander intervention early. So this is a visual representation of me as a parent, and I work really hard every day to not be this. So you may have heard of, you know, helicopter moms or lawnmower parents. They're the ones that like to clear the way for their kids so their kids have no struggles. I'm a merging of those two. It is so hard for me to not be all up in the mix, paying attention to everyone that's interacting with my kid, inserting myself in conversations with my kids to say, they shouldn't do that to you, or here, let me fix that. It is against every fiber of my being, and it's so critically important. Overprotective parenting. We see it a lot with dads, oftentimes dads with daughters. Here's some cultural examples: dads against daughters dating. There's kind of this whole sort of lexicon of humor around dads being protective of their daughters dating. And I would say that while well-intentioned, the more protective and overbearing you are as a parent, the less likely your kid will come to you when there's a low-level boundary violation. Because let's say that a kid who's, let's say there's a little girl who's 12 and her dad wears t-shirts like this and jokes regularly about it, and it's like, I'll kill anyone who hurts my kid. Then they have a coach who maybe is starting to cross some boundaries in ways that she feels real uncomfortable with. Chances are she's not going to tell her dad because she's worried that parents will go overboard and will contact the coach and will pull her out of soccer. So it's really, really critically important in talking to kids about consent that they know that they can share anything with you and that you will help them figure out how to navigate it. One more sort of comment about how girls are taught to listen and respond to their own fears. These are snippets from, I think the movie is Tarzan. And you can see that, again, from her body language, it's a great example of what I might use with kids. And I would say, like, what do you think she's feeling in those first 3 images? And kids would usually say scared, worried, nervous, annoyed. And I would say, what are you seeing that tells you that they're scared? So tell me about her body, tell me about her face. And they would say, well, she's pushing him away, her face is scrunched up, she's like pulling back on the tree. So again, really getting them to name body cues. Now, the first time a kid watches this, they have not necessarily known this, but kids watch the same movies over and over and over. By the second or third time, they are watching those first 3 scenes through the lens of him as the hero. He is the love interest. So same thing with like a Beauty and the Beast. At first, kids are mortified by the beast's behavior. They can clearly identify him as abusive. But the second and third and 57th time that they've watched the movie, they're watching the romantic love interest, the hero, the beast, performing all of those behaviors. And so it's really, really important that we're talking about self-advocacy and bystander intervention. You can use those movies. So you could say, wow, I don't really like the way the beast is treating her in that, or I don't think that it's okay the way that that character was doing that. Another way to teach self-advocacy is to ask before imposing help. So if a kid comes to you and is talking about a struggle with a peer or a teacher, asking, do you want me to listen right now, or do you want me to help fix this situation? Do you need my help, or do you want to try to fix it first? Did you tell them how it made you feel yet, or do you need help planning what to say? Because it's important for them to know that they may need to be able to just come and process, and that you as a parent or a coach or a mentor are not going to go from hearing this information to action without them having some say in what's happening. Now, obviously, if your child discloses, some form of abuse to you, you're going to have to take action. But it's really important. One of the biggest steps on how to do that is not to just, take over the situation without having your kid have some say. Pay attention to moments when you can teach helping behavior. So I keep using, I have 2 kiddos, but I would also do this, if I was a K through 12 educator, if one kid drops something in the hallway, while my instinct might be to bend down and help, I can actually pause and use that as a moment and say, hey, Michelle, would you mind helping? That person needs help. So you can teach how they can pay attention to bystander moments to intervene as a bystander. And then reflecting on helping behaviors. So we will often say, how was your day today? But it's important from an early age to say, can you think of anybody that helped you today? Or did you help anybody today? Did you get the opportunity to help anyone today? And then, when our kids go to summer camp, part of the expectations when we say, like, you need to be coachable, you need to make sure you are not running off from the group. It is an expectation that if they see kids who are being bullied, that they do something to intervene. They either say, I disagree with how you're treating that person, or they go and tell an adult that person needs some help because they're being bullied. So we talk about that as an expectation of what it means to be a part of our family. And you can do that within the context of academic setting, within a classroom, expectations that we all take care of each other. Self-advocacy and bystander intervention, professional applications. Talk to kids, not just the adults. This is big for doctors and pediatricians. They will often talk directly to me and I'm like, it's his body, ask him. Obviously, they need information from adults, but making sure that the children that you're interacting with, whether it is a niece or a godchild, rather than asking the parent in front of them, so how was so-and-so's recital, that we are intentionally engaging directly with the kids. Create environments for self-advocacy. So again, if you're a instructor, whether it's at the collegiate level, that you have in your syllabi information about how they can self-advocate, how to contact you, that you are open to that information. Make resources available in locations where kids are more likely to see them. Bathroom stalls, changing rooms, websites. With kiddos, my son is a preteen, so it's getting to the point where we will start slipping information about sex education into his bookshelf, making sure we're leaving things around the coffee table for him to pick up and look at. That can be sort of passive education in addition to the sit-down conversations we have. Explain mandatory reporting and or bounds of confidentiality in age-appropriate levels. If you're a therapist and you're working with a kid who's under the age of 18, they need to understand that there's some information that you have to legally share. Here are some of the things that you don't have to share. So, kids don't necessarily understand what our role is as a coach, as a mentor, as a tutor, as a therapist, as a dentist even. And so it's never too late to say, hey, I'm Monica. I'm going to be your new therapist, or I'm going to be your new coach. Here's some of what that means. This is what a coach can do. And so teaching kids what that means, including mandatory reporting. Pay attention to power dynamics and identity dynamics. So identify identity dynamics that might have an impact. So we know that whether it's queer and trans kids, kids of color, kids with disabilities are much more likely to be touched. People feel like they have the right to sort of touch a wheelchair or to touch kids of color's hair or ask questions about hair texture. And so it's important that as educators or as mentors, again, coaches, that we're not just looking for gender dynamics, but that we understand that the gender dynamics that influence consent, how much body autonomy someone has or does not have, it's also influenced deeply by race and class and disability. And so having ourselves, kind of aware of that. Assist by, again, narrating and intervening. I heard Dahlia say stop 3 times. Please listen to her words. Or it doesn't look like Jen wants someone touching her hair. Please stop touching her hair. So narrating, but particularly paying attention to power and identity. Infuse consent and body sovereignty into already existing anti-bullying campaigns. So pay attention to the anti-bullying campaigns that are in our K through 12 education and how very few of them talk about gender. Very few talk about, some will maybe talk about race in terms of racism or transphobia and that kind of bullying, but very few talk about gender. And when you understand the data of middle school and high school, particularly girls, and the rates of sexual harassment and sexual violence that they experience in the hallways, in the locker rooms, in the classrooms, it's kind of interesting then that we have this sort of neutral anti-bullying campaign without really diving into, hold on though, who is being sexualized? Who is being groped in the hallways? There are gender dynamics to that. Most of the time is better than never. This is a photograph of me after I flew for 4 hours with 2 small humans on an airplane by myself. I got off the plane and could barely believe I had survived it. This is not going to be my best day of parenting, right? Like, I'm not going to be like, gee, Mateo, how would you feel if we have this lunch? Instead, it's like, nope, I bought it, you're going to eat it. So just knowing that obviously life gets in the way, but we can't let perfection get in the way of us, trying to infuse some of these things. We also have complicated relationships with family. So it is harder for me to ask family members, extended family members, to honor boundaries with my kids. And I try to sort of advocate for them, but it's still harder. So I might say things like, okay, we're going to go see, Auntie whoever. And so when we get there, do you think you want to do a fist bump? Do you think you want to do a hug? Now, obviously, those were conversations I was having with my 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. Now with my 11-year-old and my 7-year-old, I'll say, you know, remember, you don't have to give anybody a hug. So when you get there, you're more than welcome to do a fist bump. It's important that we greet the people we love with love, but you don't have to give them a hug. So the way we talk about things should change. And there may be some relationships where that's not the one you're going to start with. So if you have a mother-in-law or a father-in-law or a dear great-grandmother, maybe that's not the one to start infusing this sudden need for consent. Practice in other ways, and you can even find friends in your life where you're like, you know, I really want my kiddos to learn that they can ask for consent, that they can give consent, etc. And so would you mind when you come over later asking them, do you want a high five, etc. And remember, it's never too late to start. So, you know, I have nieces and nephews who are almost 30, and we still have conversations about consent. I ask them, you know, have you talked to your little brother about sex ed yet? Have you, you know, where are you seeing this in your relationship? So it's never too late to start at least demonstrating a commitment to consent with youth in your own life. And then the last one is, you know, building a community and resources. So there's lots of abuse prevention strategies. I don't think that you need to implement them all. One of the ones I really like is the 5 trusted adults. And so my kids have a handful of adults, and, you know, I would say, Google it, read about it. You know, it's important that at least one of the adults is not a family member. And we talk through, like, if something happened and you needed help, particularly with teenagers, right? I am a trusted adult for a couple of teenagers in my life, and they know, and I have an agreement with their parents, that if they're at a party or something happens and they need help, but they don't feel comfortable telling their parents, I am a trusted adult that they can call. I will help them without telling their parents. Now, obviously, if it's a life-threatening situation, we would talk about it. That's part of the agreements of the adults. But there are lots of really good, I'm just using this as a framework. There's lots of other options, but making sure that our kids have done some forethought, some safety planning about, you know, if you really needed help, who would you call? What could you do? Now, for a 5-year-old, what this looked like was, you know, if you're at school and somebody's being mean to you, or you don't feel well, or something's not right, who in your school do you feel like you could talk to? Oh, Mrs. Wilson? Okay, great. Yeah, who else? What if Mrs. Wilson was sick that day? Who might you go to? And it's interesting, if you ask kids, are there any teachers who you probably wouldn't go to? They'll tell you, nah, I don't. And it's not necessarily that that's an unsafe teacher, but it might just be that that person, the way that they conduct themselves with kiddos, has it be that they don't feel like a safe space to go to. So again, maybe I'm just using that as one example. There's lots of strategies, but I would say if you have an influence over youth, again, whether it's a niece or nephew or your own kids, have some strategy that you have thought through and have talked through with your kids. Lessons plans and classroom policies. So making sure that you're intentionally going through lesson plans for the year, asking where am I planning on talking about the fact that kids have the rights to do with their bodies, classroom policies about touching or hitting, etc. Again, beyond just bullying, but more about like your own body sovereignty. Feedback is love is one of my guiding philosophies really for all areas of my life, whether it's in professional, but also in parenting. So we often ask our kids, you know, like, how am I doing as a parent? Like, what feedback do you have? What do you need that we're not giving you that would make it easier for you? 90% of the time, it's crap. It's candy. And, you know, I mean, I make fun. It's not really crap. It is what's important to them. But there have been times where even very recently, my 7-year-old said, you know, I feel like I'm ready for some responsibility, and you guys are so protective over what we do and how we spend our time. And that's really good feedback. So making sure that you are trying your best to not only establish that you culturally are open to feedback, working on defensiveness, but inviting that. You know, I'll say to friends, as an outsider, what do you see? How do you see me as a parent? Are there ways that you see me treating them differently? So it may seem silly. It may seem like, how is feedback is love? I came to this session about talking to kids about consent. But again, it's really about creating the foundations, the container in which the consent conversations can happen. If your kids don't feel like they can give you feedback, chances are they're not going to come to you in a tough moment. And then books and videos. There's tons of resources out there. I will share my contact information. You can reach me at rivera.prevention.education@gmail. I'm happy to send you book lists. If there's a specific context that in your own life you'd like to ask about, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to help. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Amber and say thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much. I was taking very diligent notes for things that I need to add to my own courses and my syllabi, and just so many awesome tips. We do have a couple minutes here for questions. If there are some, go ahead and type those into the chat. One that did come in was maybe any other recommendations for redirecting maybe some gender dynamics during play with younger kids. Are there maybe some examples of, how can we change some of those dynamics early on?
Yeah, I mean, I think when reading books, it's fascinating how many books for younger kids, like storybooks, the characters, whether they're dinosaurs or construction trucks, use he pronouns. And so when reading them, would sometimes switch it up. And you could see my kids were like, that's a dump truck. Why are you using she? So I would say play with pronouns in the books that you're reading and then pay attention to how kids are reacting. I also think that sometimes it's intervening in the moment. So saying, hold on, Pippa already said she didn't want to be tickled, but also later, after Pippa has left, hey, did you have fun when Pippa came over today? Are you open to some feedback? We say this to our kids a lot. Here's what I noticed. I noticed a couple times that she said she didn't want to do that. And I'm worried that, kids aren't going to want to hang out with you if they don't feel like their body's safe with you. So intervening after the fact also can sometimes help.
I'm not seeing anything come in yet. Just lots of thank yous to you, Monica. This was just so fabulous. And we will be posting this recording. So if you want to go back and rewatch, if you're registered today, you'll get an email with a link to the video, but it will also be shared on our webinar, our webpage. So you can always revisit. And Monica is very willing to answer questions too if you use that email address and just reference this webinar. We really thank you for your resources, and yeah, just a lot of thank yous are coming in. They loved it.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and we will see you back here in a couple months for our next webinar on disordered eating, supporting youth with disordered eating. So we hope that you can join us for that one as well. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everybody.